This morning, as I mentioned, for a while we've been involved in a series of studies about the doctrine of premillennialism. And I've entitled the study, The Rapture. Is the rapture soon coming? Because that's pretty much the idea that we normally hear about. The word premillennial is not used as frequently in everyday speech. But that there will be a rapture, this is a common idea that many share. If you go to work, you'll find somebody who's talking about it. If you are out at school and talking outside of class, somebody's going to mention some aspect of this theory that involves the idea of the rapture. Now, we noticed what the major tenets of premillennialism are, with the warning that there are a number of differences and that not every premillennial preacher will set forth the theory in quite the same way as every other. There are many different versions, but overall, the premillennial idea is that, of course, when Jesus first came to the world, he was going to set up a physical kingdom. He was going to sit on the literal throne of David, but it didn't work out because, according to some ways this theory is set forth, God didn't seem to realize the Jews would reject Jesus. They didn't want that kingdom at the time. So Jesus had to go back to the drawing board and come up with plan B. And he decided to make a church instead. This church, the Church of Christ, was made as an afterthought. The idea was that someday he will return again, and this next time he will be successful in establishing a physical kingdom and in sitting on the literal physical throne of David there in actual Jerusalem to rule the nations from Judea, as it was once called. And as this is about to happen, we will know it because there will be various signs at the time. Some of those we're looking at as they are abused by our friends among the premillennialists as we look at Matthew chapter 24 in this particular session. So we'll return to that thought in a moment. But suffice it to say, the idea is that we could see in any moment the Lord's about to come back, at least in this generation. We can nail it down to this time period in which we live. And when he does, he's going to first come by having the saints all to be raptured secretly. Those who are already prepared will just, well, as some versions have it, disappear right out of their clothes. They'll just disappear instantaneously to meet the Lord in the air. And most around them won't even be aware of what happened or why it happened. You've seen this as the spectacular presentation on the Left Behind series. That will be the beginning of the Great Tribulation that will last for 7 years. And we are in particular concerned with that aspect of their theory tonight, the so-called Great Tribulation. So-called in the sense in which they use it. There is a sense in which there's a Great Tribulation, as we will see, as we have been seeing in Matthew chapter 24 and also in the book of Revelation chapter 7. This is divided into two periods. The first 3.5 years has to do with the gathering in of the Jews to Jerusalem and the instituting of a worship that was like that of the Old Testament, the old sacrifices of animals. Once again, the actual temple, as it was once under Solomon, later under Herod, that temple will be rebuilt. And then in the middle of that period of time, a great series of conflicts will begin. The Antichrist will appear, and the beast and the false prophet will fight alongside him, and they will take on the saints of the earth, who would be at that time, according to that view, then the Jews, because Christians have already been raptured, and they're off in heaven, or they're off in the air with the Lord. And when the great battle of Armageddon gets so bad that it looks like evil will win, Christ will appear in the second phase of the second coming. He will come down, he will put an end to it, and he will begin to reign then supreme upon the throne of David, literally in Jerusalem, for 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. At the end of that time, Satan will be loose because he will have been restrained during that period for a short while to deceive the nations, and then he will finally be defeated. The world will end and judgment will ensue. Now, as I mentioned, many people hold to this idea. And as we talked about this morning, it is not necessarily a liberal conservative division that we're talking about. Because some have the view that unless you believe the Bible to be the inspired Word of God, that you would reject this idea. If you believe the Bible to be the inerrant Word of God, you have to accept it. And yet there's nothing whatsoever in the idea of accepting the Bible as the authoritative Word of God, word for word. There's nothing in that idea that demands we accept a premillennial point of view. Premillennialism is not as old as the New Testament. It's a theory, especially as it's articulated now, that has really arisen in the last 2 centuries, especially the dispensational variety. So as we looked at, here's the conclusion to the things we discussed in Part B of our presentation about the Great Tribulation, mostly from Matthew 24. There's simply no evidence in Revelation 7 for the Great Tribulation, as they have divided it up. The 7-year period divided into 2 halves. And Matthew 24 does not talk about a yet future Great Tribulation. Jesus was talking about these things, the things that were asked about by his disciples, because he had told them, looking at the stones of the temple, there is not one stone here that will be left that will not be thrown off of another. Every single stone will be toppled. In other words, this temple, the Jewish temple, is going to be totally, completely destroyed. And the temple was obviously the symbol of the nation, the symbol of Jewish culture. The Jewish economy itself would be definitively at an end by this time, and the world would recognize that the Jewish economy as such would have come to an end when the destruction of Jerusalem would take place, which we've noticed historically did happen in the year AD 70, approximately 4 decades after the predictions that are being made in Matthew chapter 24. We also pointed out we have to be cautious in how we look at these things that are described here, because some of the terminology, as we will see, is terminology that could also be applied to that day, as we will see the division in a moment. The division in the outline. Jesus himself is responsible for our outline in this study tonight. These things are the first part of his discussion. These things that are brought up by the disciples when they ask about when will these things be, the destruction of the temple and the end of the world. And as we mentioned, they didn't know that there might be a hiatus between the destruction of the temple and the actual end of the world. They just assumed all that would have happened together. But as the Lord explains it here, we will see there will be a long interval between the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world. As these things then are described, some of the language could also be understood to refer to that day, the end of the world. We looked at some of the warnings about false Christs before the Great Tribulation took place, that did take place in the destruction of Jerusalem. And we pointed out how that historians who were there, even on the scene, who eyewitnessed what took place, who were at the beginning a part of the rebellion, such as Josephus, tell us that this was the worst period in Jewish history. There had never been a time so tragic when so many people perished at once in such a short amount of time. Over 1 million Jews, within a matter of a few short months, perished there in Jerusalem and in Judea under the mighty hand of the Roman armies, especially Vespasian and then his son Titus, the general that was sent there to bring an end to this nation because of its rebelliousness against Roman rule. And this did effectively do away with their independence. Jesus had warned that before that great tribulation would take place, false Christ would come, and now he's warning about it again. He's reiterating this, verses 22 to 28. There will be false Christs who will allegedly appear in secret places. If they say, behold, he is in the desert, don't go out there. Don't be deceived and think that's where he will be. And here's why. Because the appearance of the Lord will not be in that way, where you'll have secret people to arise and to claim to be the Messiah. He says, but as lightning shines from east to west, Christ's coming will be visible to all. His coming, the Son of Man's coming, will be seen by all. The question now is Jesus in his discussion making a leap, sort of like a parenthesis, if you were to write it out? Is he making a leap to that final day in these words here? Is he thinking about how his final coming will literally be seen by all? Or is Jesus continuing the discussion of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, using language like this, as we mentioned this morning, painting with the colors of the final second coming and the end of the world, painting the destruction of Jerusalem with those very colors that would be taken from that final coming? Is this just apocalyptic language? In other words, poetic, symbolic language, figuratively describing the end of the Jewish economy? Those are the two major options as I see them. And it's difficult to decide, but I'm coming down on the side of the idea that he is, in fact, continuing with his discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem. He's still talking about these things that are mentioned in verse 3, and that are going to be reiterated once more in verse 34 to kind of cap off that first part of his discussion. The Jerusalem coming, when he comes against the Jerusalem rebels, those Jews who rejected his son in the person of Titus Vespasian. The death knell has already been sounded now for Jerusalem. And we can say as a generic thing, a proverb, wherever the vultures are the corpses, the vultures will be gathered. That's something we see in common experience. The vultures are now gathering. Exactly what that means, some have wondered. It has been thought it might be an allusion to the Roman standard, the Roman eagles that would sometimes generally be confused with vultures, although the ancients could distinguish between carrion birds and the noble eagle. But it might have been thought of this was a way of slighting that bird, which was their symbol. And it's possible it's actually a word for a specific kind of carrion kite, understand it, who would eat flesh as well, dead flesh. But the Lord may have been alluding to that. We don't know for sure, but we do know that he's definitely predicting the coming of armies, the Roman armies. What follows then is a very vivid apocalyptic description of the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 29 to 35. Somebody says, no, that cannot be, because he's going to talk about the sun being darkened. That must be some supernatural eclipse of some kind, or the sun just loses its energy. And the moon will not shine. Of course, it derives its brilliance from the sun. The stars will fall from heaven. The question is Jesus speaking literally at this point? Some have pointed out, even those who themselves are premillennial scholars, that if Jesus intends to speak literally here, we have a problem. Where are the stars? Well, the stars literally are all throughout the universe, clustered in galaxies. Can they fall to the earth? If only one star, being a star, fell to the earth, that would obliterate the earth. Stars, plural, could not literally fall upon the earth. As someone says, well, that's a shooting star, and it just looks like it falls upon the earth. Well, you see, then you're starting to get into somewhat figurative usage of the word star even there. A shooting star is not literally a star. So the question is Christ speaking literally? And if he were, then we have a problem with his veracity, his truthfulness. It doesn't make scientific sense to say that the stars will fall from the heavens to the earth. So there's a way in which we can understand this, which is no problem at all. If we look back at the Old Testament background, we can see that this kind of terminology had been used over and over again, not to refer to literal events in the physical universe, but as we will see, to things that would happen in the world of men, in nations. It's really stock in trade imagery, and it comes right out of these Old Testament processes. Let's just look at some. In Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 and 10, there's no doubt that the prophet's talking about the great city of Babylon and the destruction that would take place and did take place later in Babylon because of her wickedness. Here's the doom of that city, and it was a destruction that took place within the days of history, a day within days. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Did that really literally take place when Babylon was destroyed by the Medo-Persian army? There's nothing in history to indicate anything like that actually happened. But it is a manner of speaking, because the dignitaries who occupied the places of authority in the Babylonian Empire fell from their posts. They lost their status and their standing. And others came in and took over where they had authority. So there's a sense in which we can say these are symbolic of those authorities among men who would lose their place. Isaiah 34:4 is similar. Here's a warning against what will happen to the nations, and in particular, he's thinking in particular of Idumea, which is the old Edomite kingdom down south of Jerusalem. And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falleth from the vine, and as falling fig from the fig tree. Well, here again we have symbolic language, no doubt, to refer to how God would destroy the Edomites, the Idumeans, and how that did occur through the armies that came against them in the providence of God. Ezekiel has a similar kind of statement against Egypt this time. And when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof dark. And I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee, and set darkness upon thy land, saith the Lord thy God. The point in looking at these passages is to show Jewish readers and hearers would not have been unfamiliar with this when the Lord started talking about how on that day when he comes against Jerusalem in judgment, the sun will be dark, the moon would refuse to give her light, and the stars would fall from the sky. Yes, we're familiar with that. This is a way of referring to grand events as figures of speech about what would take place in the world, even of politics. These things are yet to come in this apocalyptic description. And then he says there will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Now this sounds again like it may be a reference to the last day that has not yet occurred at first glance. But as we will see, there's a way to understand this figuratively as well. And yet the figure is taken evidently from the very event that someday will happen. The Lord simply imposing on that immediate event as a type the language that would be descriptive of the antitype one day, the final end of the world of all mankind. And he's bringing it back and he's putting it on here. And the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Some have thought that may be the very banner that would come with the Son, or the Son of Man himself. But a sign is coming. He's coming with clouds. Sounds like the kind of language you find in the literal descriptions of the second coming, such as in 1 Thessalonians 4. Obviously prose and not poetry there. He will send his angels. We don't know that angels could refer to heavenly beings who are superior to mankind. But angels can also simply mean messengers, heralds. So could it be a reference to those who evangelized the world at that time? He would sound the trumpet. The trumpet would have been a symbol, like on the day of Jubilee, of freedom and liberty for the land. The trumpet would be sounded to herald the freedom that would come through the gospel. He will gather the elect from all the earth. It's easy to understand this as something that did take place, as you know in Colossians 1:23, that the gospel had been presented to every creature under heaven, even in Paul's lifetime, even before he died a martyr's death. Many were taught and converted. The elect were gathered by the preaching of the gospel. And yet, the language itself, while still in the context of referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, seems to prefigure the final judgment of all mankind. And it's uncannily close to the description that is literal in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. How could we possibly see such stark statements in a figurative way? When he says, for example, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Is that not a reference to the end of the world? Must it not be? But we see Jesus himself a little later on, before he dies, using similar language and talking to the high priest during his trial in Matthew 26:64. Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. He was abjured. He was put under oath, and in court you had to answer what you were put under oath. He was abjured by the high priest. Tell us, are you the Son of God? Are you the Christ? He said, you say so. That's correct. I am. And then he says, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, this could very easily be another poetic, figurative description of how the Son of Man was going to come in the form of those Roman armies to wreak vengeance on the rebellious Jewish nation that had rejected their Lord and Savior, and that you yourself, the high priest, will be there to witness it. And that is likely what is meant. He was still living and would see that happen. And yet, there is always the possibility that Jesus could have envisioned a time way off in the future when that high priest, just as they that had pierced him, according to Revelation 1 and verse 7, who will see him when he comes in the final event, that high priest, in fact, would be resurrected to see that. So that's a possibility. It's difficult to press these issues in every respect. These things are coming, and he says there's a parable of a fig tree, and this will help us understand how to interpret the signs. Just as the sprouting leaves show that summer is near, when you see that fig tree and the leaves are starting to come out, You know that the summer's about to come on you. It's spring already. These signs are happening, and they will show that the end is near. The end of all mankind? The end of the world? Are you saying, Lord, you're going to give us signs to see when you're coming the second time to bring us all into judgment? There will be definite signs of this coming. There will be definite signs of these things. We noticed this morning the abomination of desolation was one of those signs when the Roman armies surrounded the city of Jerusalem and then temporarily withdrew, allowing a reprieve so that the Christians who understood the words of the Lord could flee to Pella where they had safety. Historically, we know that is what happened. But there's a time limit on all of this. Truly I say unto you, Jesus says in verse 34, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. Remember, these things were the beginning of the subject that they're speaking about, they've been speaking about for a while. They ask about when will these things happen? And when will come the end of the world? And Jesus is answering about these things. What things? He said, you see these stones of the temple? They'll all be overturned. Those are the things. The destruction of Jerusalem. This generation will not pass until all these things take place. And evidently, that embraces all the things that he had just said. Otherwise, we would have to suppose that there might have been some parenthetical statements earlier that did allude to his final coming. That's a possibility. But Jesus just forthrightly says all these things will happen in this generation. And that was the prediction we had seen earlier back in his warning and his woes to the Pharisees, that your house is left to you desolate, and this will happen in this generation. And it was also the indication to the high priest that he would see these things. So right at face value, it says it's going to happen in the first century, not at some far-off, distant point in the future. There were signs of this coming of the Lord and the end of this world. Just as in the day of Amos, he said, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. Amos 4:12. There was a day of the Lord that came, a day within days. Signs were given. Jerusalem was destroyed at the end of the rebellion that began in basically AD 66. And as we mentioned, Vespasian first besieged the city. Then he learned of the death of the Emperor Nero. There was a lot of turmoil. He goes back and he sees what he can do to take care of the affairs of state. But he sends his son Titus, the general, to finish the job. This evidently was the reprieve. And that first attack was the abomination of desolation. The Jewish temple was completely destroyed, and the Jewish economy as a nation ceased to exist. This was the last definitive sign to the Jews of Christ's supreme authority. But now, Jesus shifts gears, and he does so in a spectacular way. He says, heaven and earth shall pass away. Now, here's a clue. This is talking about the end of the real world, the whole world. But my word shall never pass away. But then he goes on to say, but of that day and hour, what day? When heaven and earth shall pass away, knoweth no man. But no, you've just given us a series of signs, Lord. Of that day, no one knows. Now these things can be known when they're about to occur. Signs are given. But of that day, there will be no signs. So he's not speaking of these things anymore. He's not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem anymore. Now he's looking at that destruction of Jerusalem as a type of the antitype of the end of days. Some have said it's as though Christ is telescoping all of this by looking out over two peaks of high mountains. And he sees the one peak that's coming in 40 years, and that's the event of the destruction of Jerusalem. He sees that peak. But in the background, he sees another peak, which is the end of the world. And they look similar to one another. He's looking at it from this standpoint, and as he's describing it, he just ignores or passes over the interval of many hundreds or thousands of years between the two peaks, as we know now from our standpoint. And yet he's using very similar language to describe both events. So this is a good explanation, but he is definitely now talking about the end of the world, using the colors of that description to even paint the picture about the coming against Jerusalem. So he could have earlier pointed to those signs about Jerusalem, these things, but now he has no knowledge of the time for this final coming. He said, I don't know. How could he therefore give signs? I don't know when this final event will take place. There are no signs for that. It will be unpredictable. And he goes on to give some illustrations, as in the days of Noah. Now they had been warned, but they didn't listen. So when the flood came, it caught them all by surprise. The house of Noah was prepared, but the wicked didn't listen. Days of Noah came, the flood came and caught them by surprise. So it will be when the Son of Man comes in the end of the world. It will be something that catches us by surprise. In a sense, the destruction of Jerusalem did not catch anybody off guard. Jerusalem died by inches, little by little. You could see it coming for years, and it finally happened. This, however, is a stupendous event that will happen all of a sudden and catch humanity off guard. So what we've noticed out of all of this in Matthew 24 is that despite being used as a proof text by the premillennialists, it does not say anything about their concept of the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation mentioned here obviously is in the context of the Great Tribulation that came upon the Jews in the city of Jerusalem under the siege of Titus. It doesn't talk about the restoration of the temple. It doesn't talk about any future tribulation or any kind of battle of Armageddon. None of that is here. It's all read into the text. It's not taken from the text. In the next chapter, as Matthew has the divisions, or as they are now in our modern translations, there is a discussion of when the Son of Man comes in his glory, Matthew 25:31 and following, and all the holy angels with him. Then will he sit upon the throne of his glory. This is a very straightforward, prosaic description of his final coming. Now he's shifting into that. He's continuing that after he began that day and hour. So there will be an end of the world. By far, most of us are not expecting it as we ought. We're not forewarned. The irony is, I believe, our contemporaries deep down know that we've messed up as a people. We have messed up greatly. They know that they merit punishment. They've rejected knowledge of God. They've rejected the Lord. They've rejected the truth. But deep down, they can't completely suppress it. And our contemporaries know we've got it coming. We're due a bashing, a big one. We deserve it. We're so wicked. And so doomsdayism is prevalent. Almost every type of movie that comes out, especially science fiction. For the last 40 or 50 years, it used to be the Russians, the communists were symbolized by the War of the Worlds. Now it's us. We deserve it. Some alien comes from outer space and destroys the whole everything. The machines, the rise of the machine, everything's about a gloomy, terrible future, pessimistic future. It seems that we just instinctively know judgment is coming. Now, our contemporaries misinterpret it. And even our friends among the premillennialists have misinterpreted it. But the Bible plainly says there is a great day coming. There is a great day coming, and that day could be today. It could be tomorrow. Only the Father knows when. And when the time comes, He will send His Son. And the world will end and will be called into judgment. Are you ready for that great event? Am I ready? Have you obeyed the gospel? Have you been baptized for the remission of sins? We would urge you to make that right with the Lord and not let that to be something lingering in your life that needs to be made right. If you're a child of God who's done wrong and you need to confess it and ask for the prayers of the saints on your behalf, we would urge you to let that be known. Whatever it is, let it be known right now while together we stand and sing the song of invitation.